Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Sunday Shot for another episode. I am here as ever with my co-host, editor of The Shot, Dave Milner.
G'day, Joe. How good is everything right now?
Everything is pretty good. I'm back from a couple of trips to Adelaide, where I was there for the Fringe and the festival, and it's always good to be in Adelaide in Mad March. Today on the Sunday Shot, we are joined by writer and journalist, university lecturer, and all importantly, an arts campaigner, Dr. Ben Eltham, who I think will appear on your screen any minute. And we are also joined by freelance journalist and researcher Claire Connelly. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
It's great to have you here. I am streaming this from the lands of the mighty Gadigal people from the Eora Nation, and it is fantastic to be back. It's been quite a week, as ever. It seems like every week we fit about a year's worth of chaos and confusion into it. This week was very much marked by the tariffs issue by Malcolm Turnbull resurfacing again. He was speaking some truth to power, it has to be said. He was not holding back in his personality and indeed political analysis of Trump and the administration, and he was copping a bit of criticism for that. Ben, the media seemed to be suggesting that Turnbull was a traitor for actually describing things as they are, and that it was all down to him. Certainly News Corp's position was that it was all down to him that there was no exemption for Australia and the tariffs. What was your take on that?
News Corp. Well, I'm so glad we got straight to the topic first thing. So interesting, Turnbull. I think, the post-politics Malcolm Turnbull, he's such a different figure to his far sort of more timid and reduced tenure as Prime Minister. When you see him pop up in these kind of episodes after politics, you think, gee, this Turnbull guy's he's got some thoughts, doesn't he? He's got some things
He could have been a good Prime Minister, hey,
he could have a future in politics. Of course, there's a really interesting kind of political dynamic underlying the attacks on Turnbull for, whatever he was saying, which wasn't really, after all, that inflammatory, I didn't think. Really some quite mild pushback, I would have thought. But, I think it sort of shows the timidity of the political class and also their kind of fear, I think, of the US as a bully. They're like, well, maybe if we give him our lunch money, straight away, he won't hassle us anymore. And I think as we're seeing with Europe and other nations that pretend to be friends of the United States at the moment, that tactic's not working.
Isn't it also fascinating, like, what the ABC thought its role was in that scenario where Turnbull is stating an obvious truth and the ABC is like, shh, don't do that. We don't want to get in trouble. And you have to wonder what they think their role as journalists is if it's not to the truth. It's like they're positioning themselves as players in this powerful negotiation with a narcissistic psychopath, and that's just really not their role.
There's been a fundamental inability to come to terms with the situation Australia's found itself in, which is in a military alliance with an authoritarian state. And now that that's happened, there's all sorts of prevarications and backsliding from the sort of security establishment and political classes in Canberra, the guys who have their offices up on Russell Hill, where they're trying to pretend that everything's going to be okay, actually. We just have to wait this out. We can still get our submarines. It's going to be fine, guys. We're on an optimal pathway. And nothing to see here.
And there's just so much to see. And Dutton's intervention was sort of trying to suggest that if he was Prime Minister, he would, of course, have been able to negotiate an exemption. And why didn't Albo get on a plane and go and visit Trump and then all would have been good? Which was kind of ignoring the fact that some of the major allies who did get on planes, from Canada in the first instance, and then Keir Starmer flew over. There'd been a range. Macron was there in the Oval Office, and nobody managed to get exemptions from the tariffs. Claire, what do you think? In terms of now the response that the political class need to have to this new normal, is it better to go full Canada and to actually just say, this guy's mad, they're trying to annex us. Obviously they're not trying to annex Australia, but in terms of the Canadian context, and just be really forthright in speaking the truth about the new world order which we now inhabit.
I think part of what has gotten us here is the inability to speak the truth to what has been going on. And that's not just on the media class, that's on the political class as well.
Yeah.
But it does worry me that someone like Turnbull, who played a pretty tactical role in the politicising of the ABC. I mean, between his time as communications minister and as prime minister, I think he cut something like $325 million out of the ABC. And then, of course, you know, there was the dismissal of Emma Alberici for speaking the truth simply on a matter of the economy. So I find it a little bit troubling now that Turnbull is coming out and saying, well, what are you doing, ABC? You should be speaking truth to power, when it became considerably more difficult to do so under his leadership, and that politicising of the national broadcaster has only escalated since then.
Yeah, there's, I mean, you'd never want to suggest that politicians aren't hypocritical when it comes to these issues, and that, you know, finding all of their courage once they've left power, as Dave says. But things really do seem to be going from bad to worse on the free speech front, both in the US and then echoing through here. And I think perhaps the most ominous development, and when we've had these skirmishes with, you know, Associated Press being kept out of the Oval Office and the White House press corps because of refusing to accept the unilateral renaming of the Gulf of Mexico, for example. So these, and then there was the really quite extraordinary rant yesterday within the Department of Justice, when basically Trump was saying that criticism from the media is actually illegal. They should be illegal, and there should be redress for political leaders. I mean, do you see that sort of commentary, Ben, as escalating things to a dangerous level, or do you just think it's his normal stream of consciousness ranting and, you know, let it go and get on and do your business, media?
Well, you know, we're already in a 5-alarm fire, I think. You know, I think there's very chilling developments for freedom of speech. It's part of a bigger problem, which is that it's the end of the liberal order, right? So these kind of old ideas of liberalism and free speech, they sounded great in the 20th century, but we're in a new era now, and, you know, so there's going to be a coordination, as the Nazis used to say, a Gleichschaltung, where there'll be an attempt to actually coordinate the organs of state, the media, universities, and other public institutions, so they all get behind the dear leader.
I think Claire made a good point, which I'll expand upon. Everyone's a little bit confused at the moment because these people are the people that for the last, 8 years have been harping on about freedom of speech and how crucially important this is. And, you know, people on the left we haven't run with that very hard. That hasn't been the main point we've been trying to make over the last half decade. And now all of a sudden we're having these alarming restrictions on what we can say. Mahmoud Khalil, not a US citizen, but a permanent legal resident, has been seized by ICE, and they're attempting to send him to Syria for organizing pro-Palestinian protests. That's an escalation, regardless of Trump's rhetoric. That's something new.
Yeah, no, that was... Sorry, Claire, that was going to be my next point, is that this is a very ominous escalation in the sense that as someone who's lawfully in the US has been seized and is being threatened with deportation because of things that he has said, Claire.
Yeah, well, Mahmoud Khalil was acting as a negotiator between the protesters and the universities in order to facilitate a peaceful and if not scholarly, then, reasonable conversation about how the protests should occur and how that should play out on the campus. I mean, it was a really important role that all protests should have. It's, I don't think you could describe him as a rabble-rouser by any stretch of the imagination. He's trying to facilitate a conversation.
A conversation that people don't want to have.
Ben, sorry, I think.
I mean, what does it look like when unmarked police in sort of white van usher a fellow away from his university dormitory and into immigration gulag, not even telling the lawyers where he was for more than 24 hours. This is obviously a very chilling development for civil liberties in the United States. It's very bad for universities in the United States as well, obviously, because universities rely on scholars from all over the world traveling to those institutions to do research. Of course, another thing that's happened in the United States over the last week or so has been a devastating, or maybe it's over a month, but a devastating assault on US research. Massive cuts to the National Institutes of Health, which is the world's largest medical research funder. So all of these labs are shutting down in America, the top labs in the world for cancer research in some cases. I mean, this will be a devastating hit on medical research for the whole world into the future.
And what we have also seen is now letters being sent out to researchers worldwide. And so Australian researchers have experienced this as well. From the US, I think there's something like 34 points to it saying, how does your research align with the Trump administration's goals? And so it's a whole range of issues that they are seeking to explore on China, on gender, on health, and the researchers have to respond to this if they want to continue to get their funding. I mean, this is not just a chilling effect on the American institutions, but as you say, Ben, globally now, and how Australia responds and how the worldwide academic community responds is going to be really critical.
Yeah, it's getting bad. Here in Australia, we're seeing a very chilling development in terms of the way which universities are responding to some of the scare around the conflict in Gaza. So there's been now open investigations by universities and the Australian Research Council into an academic, Randall Abdel Fattah, for her research, which is, quite political, but, funded through an open and transparent peer review process. We've got a number of academics who are under investigation for speaking at anti-racism conferences, which kind of shows you, I think, how crazy the debate's become. And I only expect this to continue, actually.
I mean, Dave, you wrote about this as well, and some of this comes down to the definition of anti-Semitism, which is being adopted by many of the universities now, which really is much more, a much broader definition than previously had been the case.
Yeah, the 39 Australian universities adopted a definition of anti-Semitism that, does equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. It uses some weasel words. It uses the word could instead of does, but that was designed just to deflect criticism of this sort of thing. When it comes down to it, that's not going to protect anyone that's being oppressed or anything like that. That's just to avoid left-wing critique. So, I mean, it's very alarming. I wrote because my academic background is history, and so the thing that I tried to do this week was basically write a history essay that, just went over some really basic points about the colonization of Palestine, made a handful of moral judgments because, as a broad principle, colonization's kind of horrific, and then I just tried to test whether, this would be, is this okay to say? Can I still say this, or is it just brown people and Palestinians that can't say this kind of thing right now?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think, definitions of what isn't acceptable have been, and not just changed through the universities by adopting the definition from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, but also there has been active intervention legislatively coming out of the moral panic of the Dural caravan, which has now been kind of incontrovertibly revealed to have been a hoax. Ben, what does it say when our parliaments at both a state and a federal level get in such a moral panic and respond with this sort of sense of urgency, which is entirely concocted?
Yeah, it doesn't say good things, does it? Either about our political process or the spine of our politicians. They just seem so scared about the anti-Semitism charge. It's as soon as someone mentions it, they sort of go to water and they instantly reach for their latest piece of legislation. The new bill that was passed, the hate speech bill that went through federal parliament, there's been very little debate about the implications of that bill, but mandatory jail time for what are essentially speech crimes is quite a chilling development in Australia in terms of civil liberties. And you know that this will eventually be used. These laws will be used, and they probably won't be used for the sort of things that people are talking about now. They'll probably be used against climate protesters, or name some other kind of political cause that a future government decides that it doesn't like.
The trend across all Western societies the last while is ramping up anti-protest laws. I know we talked about this last week a little bit, and I think it is very much largely about the climate crisis, because they do understand inherently that that's going to get worse and people are going to get angrier and there are going to be more extreme forms of protest. So where we go with this is alarming, and I'm not a panic merchant, but I am disturbed by this stuff.
The institutions themselves are also caving on this stuff. Sorry, breaking.
No, mate, go.
Most of the universities over the last couple of weeks have banned protests on campus. So at my own university, Monash University, they just sort of rammed through a new student code of conduct that essentially outlaws protests at Monash campuses. Anything that doesn't sort of meet the approval of the Monash authorities is now against the regulations. We've seen similar regulations passed at the University of Sydney and the University of Melbourne. So these are our institutions that are meant to be about the free flow of ideas and speech and learning and debate. And entirely in response to a group of students protesting not even really against Zionism, but actually really against the war and military links between universities and armaments companies. The response has been to ban protests by students.
Which is extraordinary, because if we thought about the number of hours that I spent on ultimately futile anti-war protests when I was at university, I mean, I think there were more hours spent on those sorts of things than actually in lecture theatres. I mean, it's part of a rite of passage, or at least it used to be.
Yeah, what else are you going to do at university?
Well, that's the thing. But now it seems that because of the particular nature of this war, it's taken on a different profile and a different approach has been adopted. Claire?
Look, I don't know what to add to what has already been said, but I'm a Jewish person. I was raised Jewish, and I'm also a member of the advisory body of the Jewish Council of Australia. We're an organisation that, at our core, tries very hard to protect and represent the Jewish community against charges of anti-Semitism, but also to try and ensure that anti-Semitism is not weaponized to stifle legitimate debate. And these are extremely troubling times that we're living in. I do think it's worth adding that the definition that was adopted by the Universities Australia, it is closer to the IHRA definition, which I think includes at least 11 or 7 of the 11 examples of anti-Semitism. 7 of them are partially related to the State of Israel. Now, while legitimate scholarly and academic debate that concerns potentially the existence of Israel as a religious or theocratic state does sort of fall under the definition of academic freedom, because of the way that the definition is worded, it does put those peer-reviewed and scholarly debates under threat as being potentially anti-Semitic. It still remains to be seen how this definition is adopted by different universities. So I think that I would like to think that there is still some hope, if universities are willing to come to the table and talk to concerned groups, particularly within the Jewish community, to be able to facilitate legitimate and scholarly debate that doesn't put either Palestinian or Jewish communities under threat, but that needs to be a good faith discussion.
And Michael Bradley had a very good piece in Crikey about this issue, and some of what you picked up as well in your article for the Shot, Dave, that came out on Friday, that the idea, though, that academics within universities now have to be thinking about whether or not things that they may be saying in the context of a lecture may or may not be permissible now in universities is such a change in environment generally that, and kind of on a base level, it's going to have a chilling and really quite terrifying effect from that broad principle perspective.
I mean, we keep talking about historic patterns. This happened in the 30s, and there's a point to it. It's social engineering for a more conservative, more hateful world. And if you're not going to stand up against that, when are you going to?
Well, I think that's right. Sorry, Claire.
These, I'm trying to word this delicately.
Just go on in.
It's very hard.
The weaponization of anti-Semitism puts Jewish communities under threat. And when you have, a hoax bomb threat, for example, the debate that flows from that is harmful to Jewish communities because it is encouraging divisiveness between communities at a time when the community should be coming together to work with Palestinian communities and to work with communities that are at risk. When we said never again, it wasn't just for us, it was for everyone. And when you single out anti-Semitism as a distinct form of prejudice, as opposed to all the other forms of prejudice and racism, I think that is potentially dangerous. On the other hand, anti-Semitism is a really, really terrifying development, and it is increasing, and it continues to increase. And this invasion is helping to facilitate greater anti-Semitism because it potentially makes Jewish individuals or Jewish communities responsible for the actions of Israel. And I think it's worth mentioning that, like, the concept of Zionism is relatively new in terms of history. It never used to be the fact that Zionism and Judaism were equated. In fact, Zionism back in the day was considered an extremely radical concept. And it has become legitimized over, perhaps, not surprisingly, given, the Holocaust and the developments that happened after World War II, it has become extremely controversial to even have a conversation about Israel and its actions and what it means to have a Jewish state. But there needs to be a way to have these conversations and recognize that the existence of any religious state, whether that's Christian, whether that's Jewish, whether that's Muslim, by definition puts other communities potentially in danger. And I don't think that we can have a conversation without mentioning that if Israel is to exist, Palestinian lives and Palestinian freedom has to be, by definition, second and under threat. And it means that they are subject to a greater power than their ability to govern themselves. And it shouldn't be dangerous to say these things, because it doesn't mean that having a religious homeland isn't important to some people. I can recognize that there are a whole bunch of different positions on Judaism, on the state of Israel, and it's not my place to tell another person what that should be. But I think it starts with being able to come to the table by saying other lives are going to be under threat under the current system.
In my piece this week, I did look at, early Zionist thinkers, and, there are lots of quotes from the end of the 1800s and the 1920s where they're acknowledging that this is a colonial project, where they're acknowledging that no one being colonized has ever willingly given up their land before, and therefore they're acknowledging that this is a military operation and will be for decades. And then at the other side of that, if you're conflating the actions of the state of Israel with all Jewish people, then that's going to be responsible for a rise of anti-Semitism, because we're sitting at home watching this live stream feed of Israel slaughtering children for 15 months. And then if, you have lobbyists for that, if you have lobbyists for Israel saying that this is all of Judaism, then you are going to stoke hate crimes.
And it is that interesting thing that, Claire, you mentioned, is that this is the only form of kind of racism and discrimination that apparently warrants its own suite of legislation. That if we're going to have anti-hate and anti-racism laws, then surely that just covers all hate speech and racism. And why do we need a very specific response to this? The argument that it is just because of the scale of the Holocaust, that therefore for historical reasons somehow we should be singling out anti-Semitism in a particular way, does seem unusual. And on the point, I guess, looking at the deportation or the threat of deportation of Khalil, I mean, we did have Julian Leeser come out this week as well and say that, picking up on Dutton's kind of thought bubbles that seem to happen all over the place, that he wants to get rid of and deport Palestinian activists, that if the High Court were to block that and were to rule that you cannot deport someone because of protests or because of certain speech characteristics, that they might go to a referendum to be able to deport Palestinian activists. I mean, it seems that there is no level to which the coalition in particular, with their weaponisation of this issue, will not go, Ben.
Yeah, well, maybe we need a voice on who can be deported, hey, that reports to Parliament. I don't know, that's an idea we could consider, I suppose. In slightly more serious tone, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this stuff is a fig leaf for, just straight up ethno-nationalism. It's not just a problem here in Australia. Look at what's happening in Europe. Just 2 weeks ago, the AfD polled 21% in Germany. You've seen Le Pen nearly win the presidency in France. Look at what's happened in Hungary over a long period of time now. Talk to some friends in India. Ask them how Hinduva's going with Modi. Yeah. Right. So this is an international trend. We're seeing a move towards ethno-nationalist political frames. The coalition seems very comfortable talking in overtly white supremacist talking points, I'd have to say, in many cases. It's obviously bad. It's not good if you believe in a free society that's free of prejudice and hatred. But there's obviously a lot of political gain to be had by stoking these fires. And so you can see very cynical behaviour, particularly by some of the coalition senators. I would single out Sarah Henderson as one of these. The Liberal Tasmanian Senator Claire Chandler. They're weaponising some of these issues to take pot shots at institutions, at artists, at academics, at universities. And it's part of a bigger plan, I think, to try and pull down these public institutions for political gain.
I mean, I think this is the political purpose between isolating anti-Semitism from other forms of racism. This is... Yeah. I mean, you wrote an article about this, Joe, that, Dutton's walking this weird dance where he's trying to stoke all other forms of racism while championing a fight against anti-Semitism, and it's a very disingenuous line. It's absurd.
Well, it is very disingenuous, because then you find yourself being aligned with, actual neo-Nazis who are...
the Nazi Zionist coalition took a lot of people by surprise.
Who are the most dangerous for the Jewish community here. Ben, you mentioned Claire Chandler. Now, she obviously played quite an important role in the debacle that then engulfed Creative Australia with their dumping of the artists, which they had, mere days before been promoting to take us or to represent us at the Venice Biennale. There was a bit of a development this week there where the terms of reference for the review that the CEO, Adrian Collette, and the chair, Robert Morgan, had announced, which, perhaps unsurprisingly was all about how they could have made such a mistake in appointing the artists in the first place, and not about the appalling kind of betrayal of the artists by dumping them in that way. You were following Senate estimates, as was I. What's your take now on where Creative Australia sits?
Yeah, so for those who weren't following this story in the arts, it's a big deal in the arts and culture. The Venice Biennale is the world's most important visual arts festival, so going to the Venice Biennale is the representative of Australia. It's like going to the Arts Olympics, basically. And Australia this year had picked an artist called Khaled Subsabi, Western Sydney artist with a background as a migrant and Palestinian, He's got a long history of making really interesting, sometimes politically inflected, but also very humane and I think quite generous art. Things like, video art and installations. The Creative Australia, which is the successor to the Australia Council, Australia's top federal arts funding body, had trumpeted this decision as it'd be a wonderful artist that we're going to send to Venice. But just 5 days after that announcement, they backflipped and cancelled him from Venice after Tasmanian Senator Claire Chandler asked questions in Senate question time about former artworks or old artworks that Subsabi had made. He'd made a couple of artworks. One of them was related to 9/11, September 11 terrorist attacks, and one of them was a video image of the now dead Hezbollah leader Nasrallah. And really, it only took a couple of questions in Senate question time for the Arts Minister, Tony Burke, to ring the CEO of Creative Australia, Adrian Collette, and for Creative Australia to backflip on that decision and basically uninvite Subsabi to the Venice Biennale. So I think, once again, a chilling development for artistic freedom in Australia, and showing also just the lack of spine, really, from our nation's leading creative agency. Wouldn't back their own choice for artist for Venice Biennale beyond a single question in the Senate.
And it really was a panicked response. I mean, at the Senate estimates, when Sarah Hanson-Young, I have to say, did a very fine job of interrogating Adrian Collette as to what had caused this backflip and why there was this urgency that everything all had to happen within a few short hours. And they really had no answer. The Creative Australia had no answer at all. They hadn't even consulted lawyers, and Sarah Hanson-Young said, "Why didn't you?" And Adrian said, "Oh, there wasn't time," as if there was some deadline that was looming over them, rather than just this panic which had engulfed them, where they just wanted to distance themselves and dump Subsabi as quickly as humanly possible. Quite extraordinary. And I was down, as I say, in Adelaide for the Fringe and the festival. There were lots of industry people down there, and really that's all the industry was talking about for that first week. And the idea that Creative Australia seems to have lost all of its credibility and it will not be regained why the current leadership stays in place.
I think that's right. I think the position of Adrian Collette as CEO is now untenable. This review seems to be carefully constructed to look into why they made the decision, as you say, Joe, but not why they cancelled Subsabi. So that seems to have not been included in the terms of reference, which would appear to skew the review before it even starts. But also, the current leadership's staying in place while the review's going on. So the board's staying in place, the CEO's staying in place, and apparently they're going to choose a new artist for Venice while this review into the decision to choose the last artist is going on. It does seem a bit messy.
Yeah, I don't think there'll be any artist who will accept such an invitation after the debacle which has ensued. And I guess it also plays into a bit of disappointment generally about cultural policy under this government. There was a lot of hopes from the arts community. Tony Burke is known to be very committed to the arts. He's a big consumer, a passionate supporter, introduced new cultural policy, Revive, which was going to see some money flow and see different priorities. But a year or so on, there doesn't really seem to be as much change as one might have hoped in the industry itself. Ben's muted. We'll just get that unmuted. BT, thanks.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry.
You are.
I think... So cultural policy matters, okay? So maybe I would say that. I'm a cultural policy academic and I'm campaigning for the arts for this election, but I think it does matter, what sort of screen content our kids watch. I think it does matter, whether Australian audiences get to listen to Australian music. And that's increasingly under threat. Last year there were only 5 Australian songs in the top 100 and only 2 in the top 40. So we're increasingly not listening to Australian music anymore as Australian audiences, and that's been driven by the big platforms. The big platforms like Spotify and Netflix are increasingly dominant in Australian culture, and that's right, Dave. Great T-shirt. But these big platforms obviously are run for the benefit of, capitalist culture in culture. So who runs Netflix? It's its own studio. It's vertically integrated, screens mostly its own content. There's very little Australian screen content on Netflix. Same with Spotify. It's run by the three major labels in conjunction with Spotify as a platform, and they push largely American commercial product. And so we know anecdotally through some of my researches that the amount of Australian content on Spotify is in the low single figures. And that's a big problem. We're going to grow up with a generation of Australian kids who haven't really heard any Australian music as teenagers, and I think that'll have big flow-on consequences for the future of Australian culture.
And we were promised that there would be quotas introduced to the international streamers for Australian content. Tony Burke had said they would come through by November last year, and that just seems to have been quietly shelved with no prospects for anything happening, certainly before the election and even potentially after.
It was an election promise, and actually Tony Burke got up at the Woodford Folk Festival and announced it in early 23 that there would be, content quotas for the platforms, and it just hasn't happened.
Are we now at the point where these companies are so large and have so much money and have such a monopoly on these platforms that actually we don't have much wiggle room to negotiate? We don't have any power in these negotiations whatsoever. Is that where we're at, Ben?
I think that's the fear, but we're also a sovereign nation, or at least meant to be. So we could, if we chose, pass laws. We seem quite happy to pass all sorts of laws about social media for under 16-year-olds. Of course, will they work? I don't know. But yeah,
and about saying free Palestine as well.
Yeah. So I mean, in other spheres, politicians are more than happy to pass laws to regulate content and platforms and speech. But they don't seem so interested in regulating for Australian local content compared to international overseas content.
Now we're going to go to our interview now. So this week I spoke with Ben Raue of the Tally Room. Now we spoke on Wednesday afternoon, and before we got down into the weeds about current federal polling, I did ask him for a quick wrap-up as well on the WA election. So let's hear what Ben Raue had to say. We will hear once I get rid of this little dot there, and off we go. Ben Raue, thank you very much for joining us on the Sunday Shot.
Thanks for having me.
As expected, there was a solid Labor victory, perhaps even more solid than the Liberals were expecting in the end.
The last election was an enormous landslide for Labor, something that nobody ever expected to be repeated, and it wasn't. So, of course, there was a swing back to the Liberal Party, as was expected. But the polls over the last 6 months or so have had the two-party preferred vote around 55, 56%. So that would be taking Labor back to the vote they got in 2017, which at the time was considered an enormous victory for Labor, a massive landslide, the best ever result, and just looks small compared to what happened 4 years later. But actually, the last couple of polls we got in the last few days were saying the 2PP was closer to about 57.5%. And that looks like that's where we're ending up now. And it's going to be the second biggest ever result that Labor's had in WA, even bigger than 2017.
See, that's the extraordinary thing, isn't it? Because, as you say, 2017 was thought to be a real thumping win for Labor. And yet the commentary, certainly coming out of the coalition at the moment, oh, well, there were massive swings, so it's a mixed bag. There was some good news for us, whereas actually, given that it is still such an extreme result, there's really no good news for the coalition out of those results.
No, I don't think there is really any good news. I mean, I was expecting them to maybe get a similar result to 2017, and I expected there would be a big spin game about, is this a good result? Is this a bad result? They've made so much less progress towards what they need to achieve, towards getting back into government, that the spin game hasn't really ended up happening. I mean, right now, Labor has retained 41 seats, which is the same number they won in 2017, but that's with 9 seats left to play. And one of those, Albany, that has definitely fallen. It's just we don't know if it's going to go to Liberal or National, but there's a number of other seats where Labor has a good chance of retaining a seat. So I think they'll probably end up a little bit higher, maybe in the mid-40s. So that's clearly a number of seats better than what they got in 2017. And, there was a bit of chatter around that, if the Liberals and the Nationals between them got to about 20 seats. That wouldn't be a bad outcome. That would put them within shooting distance of winning at the next election. But instead, they're a long way short of that now. At the moment, it's 5 seats for the Liberals and 4 seats for the Nationals. So that they will go up. They will win a number of more seats than that. Maybe they end up with 15 between them. But yeah, it's a very clear win for Labor.
One of the other interesting seats in the election is the seat of Fremantle, where there's been a very strong showing by a local independent, Kate Hewlett, and it looked that she had won that seat on election night, and indeed the few days after. Simone McKirk has now clawed her way back into contention, and I think at last count was 30 votes ahead. Have you got any insight as to which way that might fall?
Look, it's going to be very close. I suspect McGurk might have the advantage. One of the things with independents is that they don't have a base of campaigners outside of their home electorate. So obviously a lot of people don't vote in their home electorate, and the absent votes are the ones that have been coming in more recently, both the absent election day votes and the absent early votes. Whereas the election day votes and the early votes that were cast in electorate in Fremantle have mostly already been counted. So it's an interesting one to watch. I don't know if there's any lessons for the federal election, because I do think federal Labor has a different position on like environmental issues compared to WA Labor. And I think that WA Labor being very right-wing on that stuff kind of created an opening on its left for an independent to challenge them.
Well, let's switch to the federal implications of the WA elections. Looking at the data of the seats that the seat of the state seats that the seat of Curtin covers, for example, do you think that Kate Chaney would be drawing hope and optimism out of those results, or it's pretty much too hard to say at this point and there aren't that many lessons to draw?
Yeah, look, you should always be cautious when comparing state and federal results. But there's some interesting lessons, I think, to take away. Like I said, that inner city, inner western suburbs of Perth, there was a swing back to the Liberals in the surrounding seats. So Cottesloe, which is the heart of Curtin, was already a Liberal seat. They actually had a strong independent challenge them who did quite well, to the point where for a little while there we weren't sure if the Liberal was going to win. We now do. The Liberal will win that seat. But they had a strong independent challenge, which is interesting. Yeah. And in the seats surrounding there was a swing back from Labor, but it was modest. It was nothing like we saw in the outer suburbs of Perth. So I think all of that is probably encouraging for Kate Chaney. Kate Chaney is not the same as a new independent who's running for the first time. She's an incumbent. She's been there for 3 years. The personal vote effect, particularly at a federal level, is quite significant. And independents usually, once they get in, do quite well. So I suspect she'll have all of that to boost her. And I think the other thing to take away is, there's no great surge of popularity for the Liberal Party coming back from the last election in state politics. And I suspect that's what's going to happen federally. When we look at the federal polls that break down by state, the swing back from Labor in WA is not very big. It's actually quite modest. It's about 2% in the latest polls. And that's not what we would have expected about 2 years ago.
No, that is surprising, isn't it? Because, Labor did so well at the last federal election. It was kind of the, I think, equal best result with 1983 result, 55%. And yet they are holding on in WA, traditionally a conservative state, in ways that are a bit unexpected.
Yeah, in almost all the history, since we can kind of take this data back to the late 50s, that's the sort of the first time that we had elections where every seat was contested. In that time, Western Australia has almost always voted to the right of the rest of the country. And in 2022, it voted a long way to the left compared to the rest of the country. It's the reason why Labor won a third Senate seat in WA, which they've never done before. Fatima Payman, who's no longer in the Labor Party, but that was the thing that meant that it had a big impact on the progressive makeup of the Senate. And then in the lower house, of course, they won a lot of seats and they won big. So, yeah, we would have expected a couple of years ago that there would be a decent-sized backlash of a swing back to the old normal. But the swing looks pretty modest right now. In contrast, Victoria seems to have a bigger swing back. Labor did quite well in Victoria and they did quite well in Western Australia last time, but it seems like Victoria is the place where they're losing ground more significantly. Whereas in Western Australia, they're doing pretty well. You know, there's a seat that's a notional, newly created seat called Bullwinkle that has no sitting MP. On paper, it's a Labor seat, but at any other election in recent decades, it would have voted Liberal, except 2022. Because there's no sitting Labor MP there, I suspect that's likely to go to the Liberal Party. But in all the other seats the Labor won, where they have first-term MPs defending their seats, that is going to be a big boost for them. And right now the polls suggest that they have a good chance of holding on to all those other seats.
Because you've talked about the so-called sophomore surge, where first-time MPs, because they're not known to their electorates or they haven't previously been known to their electorates, and they get out there and they engage deeply with the community, and so they are become better known over the course of that first term, that their personal vote then, for the first time, builds, and they have a better chance of holding on to seats when a swing might be on than some others, you know, who've been there for longer.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're a federal MP in particular, you get a big communications budget. You know, you get to send out newsletters, you're in all the local papers. If it's a regional area, you're on the TV, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And you're just out at events, people get to know you, and it has a big effect. And the biggest sophomore surge we tend to see is when someone has been elected and they've defeated an MP from the opposing party. So it's both that the other party's personal vote has gone away and there's a new personal vote for the new MP. There's reason to think there could be a few of these seats where Labor might do relatively better there compared to the swing elsewhere.
Now, at the moment, the polls are very close. Most of them seem to have the coalition marginally ahead, although there was YouGov came out this week, which actually had Labor just ahead. But when you sit and you look at the electoral map, the pathway to victory remains very tough for Dutton, particularly with WA holding up. Queensland seems more or less status quo when you dive into some of the data. South Australia, where I'm recording this interview from today, the lands of the mighty Kaurna people, some people are talking about them winning Boothby back with Nicole Flint recontesting. That seems really unlikely to me. Nicole Flint was actually very unpopular as a local MP, and Sturt is potentially in play as a loss. So the pathway, even taking into account some swings coming back in Victoria and along the coast of New South Wales, it is still very difficult.
Yeah, they need a big swing. The prospects that anyone's going to get a majority are quite small at the moment. You know, the MRPs that have been conducted recently by YouGov and by Redbridge and Accent Research have calculated that the probability of a hung parliament is very high. And so if you're Peter Dutton, the question is more, can you get close enough to a majority that some of the independents will support you in government? And actually the bigger question is, can you get close enough to a majority to make it impractical for Labor to form a government? You know, if you get to a point where Labor, maybe if Labor got every Green and every Teal MP to support them, they could theoretically form government, but they would not want to form government in those circumstances and it would not be considered very stable. And in that kind of scenario, I think maybe some of the more conservative Teals might say, let's see if we can find a way to make a deal with the Liberals. And I think that is a possibility on the current polls. And we'll see where the trend goes in terms of those. But, you know, the coalition probably does need more than 50% of the 2PP to win. One of the big questions now is how are they going in those higher margin Labor seats in outer suburban areas where the Liberals clearly are making an effort to try and make progress in those seats. The MRPs did show that there was a bigger swing there than what we were seeing elsewhere, that in seats like, I'm thinking of seats like Werriwa in Sydney, Shortland in Lake Macquarie, also in New South Wales, Holt and Hawke in Melbourne. They're all seats that have always been Labor held, but they are getting less and less Labor friendly over time. And so there is a bit of evidence that maybe some of those seats are swinging hard, but Liberals probably need to do pretty well to do that. You know, if that latest YouGov is right and there's a bit of a swing back to Labor, it probably closes the door on those seats, even if, you know, in maybe 5 or 10 years, they may be super marginal, but they're not quite there yet. And yeah, I think there is also a big question about, do they make any progress in winning back those inner city seats? Because the Liberals lost a lot of seats in the inner city that they used to rely on at the last election. They lost 6 to Teal MPs. They lost 3 to the Greens. They also lost a couple to Labor. And I think they may make a bit of progress in making some of those back, but I don't think they're going to I don't think they're going to take them all. So,
do you have any sense of which ones?
look, I think for Brisbane, for the Greens, I think probably Ryan is more vulnerable than Griffith. I think Griffith is a stronger seat for the Greens. I think in Sydney, McKellar is not quite as friendly to them as Warringah and Wentworth. Wentworth in particular has been expanded to take in quite strong Labor voting areas around the inner city of Sydney and like the Randwick area. And then, I think Curtin in WA could be a question mark. That's one to watch as well. Two of those inner city seats that they lost have now been abolished. Higgins and in Melbourne and North Sydney in Sydney.
Yeah.
That's also created flow-on effects for Labor MPs in neighbouring seats. So Chisholm in Melbourne and Bennelong in Sydney have this parallel between them. They're both very multicultural seats that have just been pulled closer to the inner city by this redistribution. And they've taken in areas that used to be really, really good for the Liberals, and now they're just a little bit good for the Liberals. Like it's hurt Labor in those seats a little bit, but much less than it would have if this happened a decade ago.
Do you see any real risk for Labor with more community Daly-style community independence? She took the seat of Fowler. A lot of people are talking about the Muslim votes, in seats of Watson, seats of Blaxland.
I don't think there's many people in that Daly category to watch. I mean, she was a very particular kind of candidate. She was very strong on the local council. Her ally, Frank Carbone, who's the mayor of Fairfield, they run that council with a supermajority. Her election was not all about Christina Connelly, but I don't think she would have gotten elected if it wasn't for the fact that Labor put up a candidate like Christina Connelly who didn't have any of those local links. I don't see a lot of other candidates like her. I don't think the Muslim votes candidates are in that same category, but we'll have to see how they go. The candidates are impressive. They clearly have strong campaigns in their seats. They have credibility. They're not just random people from the community who've put up their hands. But I don't know. I don't think those kinds of seats, people in those areas have a lot of experience voting for independence. And I think it'll be interesting to see how many people they can get out there to campaign for them and to vote for them. I think they have made seats interesting that would have otherwise not been interesting. But I think probably winning is probably a bit more than is reasonable to expect.
And finally, do you think there are any seats where there are realistic prospects for new Teals or community independence? Obviously, Bradfield has been targeted by Nicolette Buller, for she's been campaigning essentially since the last election. People like, I guess, Kaz Heiss up in Cowper, Deb Leonard maybe in Monash.
Bradfield is obviously the best prospect for an extra Teal to get elected. Nicolette Buller came reasonably close last election, and the redistribution has given her better areas for Teals, and she doesn't have a sitting Liberal MP to run against. The big question will be, in the absence of all of the big national questions that were dominant in 2022, that helped those other Teal MPs get elected, they now have the benefit of incumbency to help them substitute for the fact that, Scott Morrison's not the Prime Minister anymore. She doesn't have that. So that'll be worth watching. And apart from that, I think most of the other ones that are interesting are in regional areas, and they're a little bit different. Sometimes I wouldn't refer to them as Teals, although some of the things are the same, and they do still have that same mathematical goal, which is to be the leading progressive in their seat, and then to peel off a few National Party votes or Liberal Party votes that would not be willing to vote for Labor to get them over the line. And so Cowper is one to watch. That covers Coffs Harbour, Port Macquarie. Port Macquarie previously elected Rob Oakeshott and has a history of this. Hilaire in central New South Wales has a history of electing an independent for a long time, Peter Andren, who was there from 1996 to 2007. That also has the interesting example where the sitting Nationals MP has become an independent.
That's right,
He's running again, but there's also more of a progressive independent. And then you mentioned Monash as well. The circumstances of the sitting MP are a bit different, but again, the Liberal MP for that area quit the party when he lost pre-selection. So those are seats where you've got a kind of tealish community independent, but you've also got an ex-coalition independent sitting MP, and how all they interact, they will make those races really complex. So I think there's a few of those people to watch, but I do think all of those independents who got elected in 2022 was exceptional, and I don't think we will see a big surge of them getting re-elected. I think for people who are supporting those Teal candidates, just getting all of the sitting MPs re-elected would be an achievement. So I think people's expectations have maybe been changed by that exceptional result in 2022. But like,
Yeah,
they're not
look,
going to win
that's
another
true, and I
6
think because
seats.
there's such an ambition to seize the balance of power, because that would just remake Australian politics in such an interesting way.
Yeah.
That there's lots of optimism, ambition, and lots of hard work on the ground. And even at the WA election commentary on Saturday night, so many of the MPs were saying how important that ground game is, and that is something that the community independent candidates have really learned and continue to implement really effectively.
Yeah, I mean, it's now been 12 years since Cathy McGowan got elected, replacing Sophie Mirabella in Indi. And so I think over time they've shared knowledge, they've learnt things, they've experimented. And so I think one of the things that's always disadvantaged minor parties and independents is there's just so much more knowledge and experience in the major parties. They just have lots of people, and not just people out on booths, but experienced people who know how to run campaigns. And I think over time, the independents are building up their own bench of people, as the Greens did. The Greens have done that over the last couple of decades. I think the chances we're going to have a hung parliament are really high, but there are lots of different types of hung parliaments. The hung parliament will be very different if, like, the coalition falls 1 seat short of a majority. Will be very different to if Labor falls a couple of seats short of a majority, or one where neither of them is close to a majority. And that one's probably the one where the minor parties and the independents have the greatest influence. But it's going to be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, well, for political nerds, it's going to be fascinating. We don't have long now, so good luck for the next few months. And thank you very much for joining us on the Sunday Shot.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so interesting analysis from Ben Raue from the Tally Room. One thing that struck me about that, Claire, was he talked about the exceptional results of the 2022 election, with the 6 new Teals were elected, joining Warringah and Indi community independents, and that it would be really an extraordinary if all of them could be re-elected, and getting more, perhaps we're setting too high expectations. But another perspective on that, of course, is that things have changed, and that people are sick of the duopoly. There is a frustration with both of the major parties, and so it's not just a response to Morrison, but that we are seeing a shift in what is going on in our broader electorate.
When we talk about the Teals, I think it's important to remember that at least one of those seats has been redistributed out of existence, which is actually my local electorate, North Sydney, under Kylie Tink. I don't know if Tink was officially considered a Teal because she didn't adopt the colours.
Oh, no, she was. Because the Teal is more about the policy position.
An independent candidate that weirdly was redistributed into a different electorate, and now she will no longer be able to represent the people of North Sydney at the next election. And the justification was that there have been demographic changes and that the electorate was shrinking. But part of the reason the electorate was shrinking is that they got rid of a bunch of housing to make room for new development. So by the time the next election rocks around, there'll be 3,000 more people in the electorate, but we still don't get our own electoral representative. And I would be concerned. I would have to go back and look at my research, so I don't quote me on this, but I think that it was not the only Teal seat that has been redistributed for the next election. I don't think we have the groundswell right now that we did at the last election for the Teals. I'm certainly not seeing the same public discussion or fervour around independence that we did at the last election. And with one coming up so soon, my concern, aside from changes in political donation laws, I think in South Australia and in Victoria, which make it really difficult for independents to get up at all, we're also just not seeing the same amount of publicity or public discussion around independent candidates that we were at the last election.
Would you agree with that, Ben? I mean, I think part of it is, of course, is that it's on the ground where it matters, and there do seem to be lots of very active campaigns happening on the ground that perhaps we're just not seeing reflected in the national conversation. Do you think there is more of a a sort of a fundamental shift going on, or do you think it was a reactive kind of response to Morrison and the horror of those years?
Look, a little of column A, a little of column B. I think it is very geographically determined. So I live in Wannon. I live in Western Victoria, and I'd have to say Alex Dyson's doing pretty well out here. I'd say this will be the most competitive federal election in the seat of Wannon in 70 years. I mean, this has been a safe Liberal seat forever. It used to be Malcolm Fraser's seat. To have a sort of active community independent come into a rusted-on seat like this, I think, has definitely changed the vibe in terms of federal politics out here. Whether he will win or not, I think, it's still a pretty safe Liberal seat.
Before we go, just throwing to the panel, if you have any top tips, anything that you have been keeping your eye on, any recommendations you'd like to make. I'll start just by saying that tomorrow we have Jason Gillam going to the federal court in his case against the MSO. Which was another one of those sort of chilling effects about artists being told to shut the fuck up, essentially. And the MSO are taking a bit of a leaf out of the Catholic Church and even the ABC's books by arguing that this case should be dismissed because he was not actually an employee. And so potential implications certainly for freelance artists everywhere, but also all contracted workers. So one to keep an eye on. Claire, anything that's caught your eye that you'd like to raise?
Not really. Just keeping an eye on the hellscape that is America really is taking up all of my attention right now. I think it's really important that we put pressure on our political representatives to ensure that we have some kind of leverage in the upcoming trade wars. I'm very concerned about the economy, obviously. It looks as though America is tipping towards a recession, and if that happens, it's going to have ripple effects, across the world, including in Australia. And it's, also important that we don't let other political issues fade into the background, particularly Gaza. I can't believe that we still have to have this discussion, but I would encourage people to contact your representatives, particularly if you are a member of the Jewish community and you are concerned. There has never been a time in history where we've seen such vocal opposition from within the Jewish community than it is now, and that gives me some sort of hope that these discussions are becoming more legitimate. And I think we have a deep obligation as Jewish people to speak out for our Palestinian brothers and sisters. So please call your political representatives, put pressure on them, and to raise your voices to try and help the people of Palestine.
And on the issue of Gaza this week, it was revealed that there have been conversations between Israel and the US and various African nations where they've been trying to find a place to dump the 2 million Gaza residents when they move in for their real estate deals. Just kind of unbelievable. Ben, what's caught your eye?
A little bit like Claire, the US economy, I think, is of real interest. If there is a downturn gathering steam over there, then that's going to have big impacts on both American politics and the global economy. Also, there is a Senate inquiry into university governance going on at the moment, which I think is really interesting and one worth watching. So senators will be looking into the epidemic of wage theft in Australian universities, which is now over $250 million over the last few years, and also Vice-Chancellor remuneration, which is always one that people get pretty interested in.
Yeah, two ends of the spectrum there in terms of remuneration.
Underpayment and overpayment.
Yeah.
I said basically everything I wanted to say in my piece on Friday, but I did promise my son that I would say save the sharks. So I don't know what's happening with the sharks at the moment. I haven't really looked into it, but do save them if that's in your capacity.
Yeah,
so,
well, please do. And please also, if you are able, think about donating a small amount to the shot so that we can keep the Sunday shot on air till the election, now clearly going to be in May. You will see a QR code come up at the end of the credits, which you can just scan or otherwise just go to our website. But we are looking forward very much to being back with you next Sunday, when we're going to have a bit of a focus on young people, both policy Psychology and Approach to Politics. And we've got Conrad from Punters Politics coming on, and Anjali Sharma from The Duty of Care. So it's going to be a great one next Sunday. Look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks for hanging out, everybody.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks very
Joe.
much.
Thanks, Joe.